Have you ever stopped to wonder where the very idea of owning a book or maybe a song actually came from? It really wasn't always a given, and frankly, the journey to get here is way more complex and fascinating than you might think. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the intricate origins of copyright. We're focusing on a really pivotal 18th century legal battle in England, Millar v. Taylor in 1769, and then its surprising reversal, Donaldson v. Becket, just a few years later in 1774.
Exactly. And to really get our heads around these cases, we'll be looking at legal analyses, some great historical accounts, and academic research, too. Our mission really is to give you a shortcut to understanding how these cases, well, they didn't just define intellectual property as we know it. They also set up these competing ideas of ownership that, still echo today in how we treat creators and information.
Yeah, we're going to explore the theories of property underneath it all, the changing roles of authors versus publishers, and how these foundational moments, these arguments from centuries ago, still resonate in modern law. It's pretty wild. So, yeah, let's peel back the layers and see how this all started.
Okay, so the story really kicks off with a massive technological shift. The printing press arriving in England way back in 1476. Before that, copying text was slow, painful, manual work. Books were rare, super expensive. But suddenly, you could mass reproduce things. And this challenged, well, every traditional idea about what property even was, like who controlled all these copies popping up everywhere, and who owned the ideas inside them. It was a whole new ballgame.
It's incredible, isn't it, just thinking about the disruption. Suddenly, hundreds, thousands of copies. The old ways just couldn't cope. But it took, what, over 200 years? Until 1709 for Parliament to finally step in with England's first proper copyright statute, the Statute of Anne. That really set the stage for a new era, didn't it?
It absolutely did, and it immediately kicked off what historians call the literary property debate.
Mm-hmm.
And this wasn't some quiet academic chat, oh no. This was a fierce commercial battle for control. You had these powerful London booksellers like Andrew Millar, the plaintiff. In our main case, they'd invested heavily in the old system before the statute. They were desperate, really, to keep their grip on the book trade. It wasn't just about the money. It was about controlling the flow of information itself.
Right. And this leads us straight into Millar v. Taylor in 1769. This is where the Court of King's Bench finally had to really grapple with the core questions of copyright head on. For the first time, it was the big leagues. And the key question was, is an author's right of copy a perpetual common law property right? Does it exist forever, naturally? Or is it limited by laws like the Statute of Anne? The whole future of publishing kind of hung on this.
And what's really fascinating here is Lord Mansfield. He was the chief judge in Millar. He took this natural law approach. He argued copyright wasn't just about, the commercial side, the bookseller's interests. Critically, he grounded it in the personal interests of the author.
Okay, so when Mansfield talks about grounding it in the author's personal interests, beyond just commerce, what did he mean by that? Was it about protecting their reputation or the integrity of the work itself?
Exactly that. Mansfield really pushed the idea that authors have a natural right to the fruits of their labor. And crucially, also the right to control the reputation and integrity of what they created. He famously said, no one should be allowed to reap where he has not sown. So for him, copyright had this dual purpose. Yeah, protect the economic side, but also protect the author's identity, their connection to the work. It's pretty revolutionary thinking for the time.
That makes a lot of sense. But copyright,
Yeah.
it's intangible, right? Unlike land or, a chair. How did the court deal with that? Because traditional common law property was usually about physical stuff you could touch.
You've nailed a key problem they faced. The court absolutely recognized copyright presented unique challenges. It wasn't easily assimilated by the existing property rules. It wasn't about owning the physical book on your shelf. It was about controlling the right to copy the content. This forced them to fundamentally rethink what property could even mean.
And the booksellers, they had a practical way to push their claims, right? Seeking those chancery injunctions.
That's right. Court orders to stop people printing or selling copies that infringed. These injunctions became a really key legal argument for them. It showed courts were already sort of recognizing some kind of right even before Millar fully defined it. And another bit of important context here. Earlier on, printing regulation was tied up with the crown, with state censorship, royal prerogative. But by the time Millar came around, judges like Mansfield and Justice Aston, they flat out rejected that idea. They said the crown didn't control the press just because it felt like it. Any rights the king had came from the king's property and his copy. Like if he commissioned a work, That was a huge shift, moving control away from, the monarch's whim towards a more objective rights-based idea.
Yeah.
Really fundamental for legal thinking.
Wow. Okay, so Mansfield's vision in Millar was pretty powerful. Rooted in natural law, author's personal connection. Sounds quite solid, but you said the tide turned. How did that happen?
It did turn. Mansfield's victory in Millar, well, it didn't last long. The fight wasn't over.
Hmm.
Just 5 years later, in 1774, Donaldson v. Becket came along and delivered this stunning reversal. It basically reshaped copyright in England for centuries. And the seeds for that reversal, they were actually sown right there in Millar, in powerful dissent from Justice Yates.
Ugh. Justice Yates. The lone dissenter in Millar. What was his big issue with Mansfield's conceptual common law copyright idea?
Yates's objection was fundamental, really deep. He just couldn't square common law principles with property that wasn't physical. For him, property had to be, and I quote loosely here, something visible, which has bounds to define it and some marks to distinguish it, something you can point to. He argued that a right like copyright, which is mostly about stopping others from doing something, like copying rather than possessing a thing, could only exist as a statutory right. It had to be created and limited by Parliament, by political choice, not found in some ancient common law principle. He was genuinely worried about an unlimited scope otherwise.
So basically, Parliament gets the final say, not judges inventing perpetual rights from common law, and Donaldson v. Becket cemented that idea.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
While the exact details of the Donaldson ruling were a bit murky at first, the common interpretation, the one that stuck, was that any common law copyright, especially after a work was published, was essentially wiped out by the Statute of Anne. It was now subject entirely to the terms and limits set by Parliament in that statute. The dream of perpetual common law copyright. Over.
And wasn't there a judge in Donaldson, Lord Camden, who had some strong words about judges sticking to the rules?
Oh, absolutely. Lord Camden issued this stark warning. He said judges must hew to precedent, stick to existing law, and not furnish new law. Otherwise, he warned, it would not be law at last, but legislation. A job for Parliament, not the courts. He was also pretty cynical about the private interests of the booksellers driving the case. He questioned if perpetual copyright was really the only fair reward for authors. It's a good reminder that behind all the legal theory, there were big commercial stakes.
That does raise a really interesting point. What about the authors in all this? Were their interests truly the same as the powerful booksellers lobbying for these rights?
That's a fantastic question, and it's complex. Lyman Patterson, in a study from 1968, actually argued that this whole literary property fight led to a kind of distortion of copyright theory. He suggested publishers and authors, well, they often had different goals, even if they seemed aligned. Publishers, Patterson argued, basically used the author's natural desire for protection to lobby for laws that ultimately benefited the publisher's business models most. Authors back then just didn't have the economic power, really, to dictate terms when selling their rights. It was definitely a power imbalance.
So, beyond the court cases themselves, this whole debate actually changed how people even thought about property, didn't it? A much bigger ripple effect.
Oh, definitely. If you zoom out, scholars like Patrick Attia argue that Donaldson, in particular, really exposed something fundamental, that property rights weren't natural or God-given. They were, in fact, artificial creations of law based on underlying values and policies.
Yeah.
The huge takeaway here is that copyright isn't some static thing we discovered. It's a legal tool we invented and keep reinventing based on technology, economics, and what society values.
Wow, that's a massive conceptual leap.
Yeah.
From something inherent to something designed.
It really is. And this shift kind of paved the way for later legal thinking, like Holvelt's analysis, which started describing property less as a right over things and more as a legal relationship between people concerning a resource. Who owes duties to whom? It's subtle but important.
And this connects somehow to personhood theory and copyright. That sounds fascinating. How does that fit in?
Right, so personhood theory, drawing on philosophers like Hegel and later developed by people like Margaret Radin, suggests that to fully develop as a person, to be a person, you need some control over resources in your environment. And often, these guarantees of control take the form of property rights. So, applying this to copyright, the idea is that it's not just about earning money, it's actually seen as important for self-development, for expressing your identity.
Okay, so copyright as part of being human, almost.
In a sense, yes. Hegel himself discussed copyright, seeing it as an externalization of the creator's will, their personality. From this viewpoint, copyright serves an ethical purpose, self-construction. It lets the creator control this extension of themselves that they put out into the world through their work.
It's actually kind of striking how Lord Mansfield's arguments back in Millar seem to, pre-echo some of that thinking.
He really did. Remember how Mansfield explicitly linked the author's interest in the reputation, the integrity of the work, to why the property right should exist? That idea, copyright protecting an extension of his person, is a direct line to these later personhood theories. It shows this thinking about authorship being tied to identity, not just cash, was there early on.
And this idea, this personal connection, it did eventually find its way into modern law, didn't it? You mentioned Canada.
Yes, exactly. Much later, Canadian copyright law explicitly included moral rights, starting with their 1921 Act. These include the right to be named as the author and the right to stop your work from being distorted or mutilated in a way that harms your reputation. Even today in Canada, these moral rights are legally distinct from the economic copyright, although interestingly, they've been waivable since 1988. But it's a clear legacy of valuing the author's non-economic stake.
Thinking back to those early cases, though, the actual legal right authors had was pretty narrow initially, wasn't it?
Oh, very narrow, yes. Basically restricted to publishing and reprinting the original work. Pretty much word for word. There was very little protection for what we now call derivative uses, things like adaptations, translations, movie rights. None of that. Justice Yates's big fear, remember, was precisely this: an uncontrolled, unbounded right, if it wasn't strictly defined by statute.
And the whole concept of originality also changed over time. It wasn't just about being the first person to print something.
Absolutely. The Statute of Anne didn't explicitly say originality was required. Early English courts mostly just looked at, did the defendant copy the plaintiff's actual book?
Hmm.
Simple copying. But later on, the idea of originality needing some spark of creativity or independent effort, not just being the first, became a really central legal pillar for copyright protection.
Which brings up a huge point. How far has copyright expanded since then? Because it's definitely not just novels and songs anymore.
You're absolutely right. Modern copyright protection covers this incredibly vast range of things, way beyond what we traditionally call creative. Think business directories, insurance forms, databases, even the text written on tombstones, believe it or not. And yes, even schedules for horse races put together by track officials. It's stretched incredibly far.
A horse race schedule?
Yeah.
Seriously, that seems, well, pretty far removed from poetry or music. What's the logic there?
It does seem that way, doesn't it? There's a really interesting Canadian case, PC Jockey Club v. Standen, that dealt with exactly that, the overnight race schedule. Copyright was found to exist in it. And the key reasoning seemed to be less about the creative expression and more about protecting the information that resulted from considerable labor and organization. It really points towards a labor theory justification, sometimes being used in copyright. The idea that the effort, the skill, the judgment, the work involved in compiling information creates value that deserves protection, even if the end result isn't art in the traditional sense.
Wow. Okay, so there we have it. What a journey. From the printing press shaking everything up to Parliament stepping in through these huge court battles like Millar and Donaldson, we've really seen copyright morph from this kind of hazy, maybe natural common law idea into a property right defined and limited by statute. A constant negotiation, it seems. And I think the key takeaway for me from all this is that copyright isn't static. It wasn't just found. It's something we've constructed and keep reconstructing based on technology, money, and societal ideas.
Couldn't agree more. And those historical tensions we talked about, copyright is just an economic tool versus copyright is reflecting something deeply personal about the author. Those debates are absolutely still alive today. They shape arguments over fair dealing, fair use, the length of copyright terms, the public domain, all of it. Those foundational clashes from the 18th century are still playing out.
So, thinking about today, what does this whole deep dive into copyright's past tell us about its future? Especially now, with information created and shared so incredibly fast. As information becomes maybe our most valuable resource, how do we keep balancing the creator's rights, which clearly have deep historical roots, with the public's need for access to knowledge? How do we make sure we encourage innovation and ensure broad societal benefit? It feels like the balancing act just gets trickier, doesn't it? It's a question that's definitely still evolving, just like copyright itself always has.